The iron bars felt cold against Eleanor Hartwell's palms as she pressed her face between them, watching the dusty street of Dodge City through the jailhouse window on that sweltering June afternoon in 1878. $3. That was all that stood between her and freedom, yet it might as well have been $3,000 for all the chance she had of producing it. The debt had accumulated over 2 weeks of meals at the boarding house after her stagecoach money had been stolen, and when Mrs. Pemberton had marched her before the marshal that morning, Eleanor had discovered that Kansas law permitted imprisonment for unpaid debts. Now she sat in a cell barely 6 feet wide, her traveling dress wrinkled and stained, her dark hair escaping its pins, and her pride shattered into pieces smaller than the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunlight. She was 23 years old and had been traveling from St. Louis to meet her cousin in Abilene, hoping to start fresh after her father's death had left her penniless and alone. The thieves who had ransacked the stagecoach 2 weeks prior had taken everything: her small inheritance, her mother's wedding ring, and any hope of the new life she had envisioned. She had managed to keep only the clothes on her back and a single photograph of her parents tucked into her bodice. Mrs. Pemberton had seemed kind at first, offering her a room and promising she could work off the debt once she recovered from the harrowing robbery. But after 14 days of washing linens and scrubbing floors, the boarding house owner had suddenly demanded immediate payment, claiming Eleanor was too slow and her work insufficient. The sound of boots on the wooden planks outside made Eleanor step back from the bars. Marshal Wyatt had left an hour ago, muttering something about a disturbance at the Long Branch Saloon, leaving her alone in the suffocating heat. She moved to the small cot in the corner and sat down, fighting back tears that threatened to spill. Crying would accomplish nothing. She had learned that lesson well enough over the past months. The door to the marshal's office creaked open, and she heard voices, one belonging to Marshal Wyatt, the other unfamiliar, deep and calm with a slight drawl that spoke of Texas origins. Eleanor could not make out the words, but something in that second voice made her stand and move back toward the bars, straining to hear. $3, you say? The unfamiliar voice asked. For how long has she been here? Just since this morning, Marshal Wyatt replied. Margaret Pemberton brought her in. Says the girl owes for 2 weeks of room and board. Law's the law, even if it seems harsh for such a small amount. Seems more than harsh to lock up a woman over pocket change, the stranger said, and Eleanor detected a note of disgust in his tone. What's her story? Says she was robbed on the stagecoach from St. Louis. I remember the incident. 3 masked men stopped the coach about 15 miles east of here, took everything from the passengers. We never caught them. Miss Hartwell there had no money, no prospects. Margaret took her in, or so she claimed, out of charity. Margaret Pemberton does nothing out of charity, the stranger said flatly. That woman has a heart of stone and a love of money that would shame a railroad baron. I would wager she worked this girl half to death and then decided she would rather have cash than labor. There was a pause, and then Eleanor heard the distinctive sound of coins clinking together. Her heart began to race. Here's $5, the stranger said. 3 for the debt and 2 for the girl to have in her pocket. Release her. Now hold on, Mr. Callahan, Marshal Wyatt said, and Eleanor finally had a name for her unexpected benefactor. You cannot just go around paying off debts for strangers. What is your interest in this woman? My interest is that I am a Christian man who believes in mercy and I need help at my ranch, Callahan replied evenly. I have been in town looking to hire someone to help with cooking and household management. My sister used to handle those duties, but she married last month and moved to Colorado with her husband. I have been living on burnt beans and stale bread ever since. If Miss Hartwell is willing to work, I am willing to offer her employment, fair wages, and respectable accommodation. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Was this truly happening? Was she about to be freed by a complete stranger who wanted nothing more than a cook and housekeeper? I will need to ask her, Marshal Wyatt said, though he sounded resigned. Miss Hartwell, can you come to the bars, please? Eleanor was already there, gripping the iron rod so tightly her knuckles turned white. Beyond the marshal's bulky frame, she could see a tall man in his late 20s, perhaps 30 at most, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that brushed his collar. He wore dusty working clothes, denim trousers, a worn leather vest over a cotton shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat he held in his hands. His face was angular and weathered by outdoor work, but his eyes were a striking blue-gray that seemed to look straight through to her soul. He was not classically handsome in the way of the illustrated men in the dime novels she had once read, but there was something solid and trustworthy about him that made her want to believe in his offer. "Miss Hartwell," Marshal Wyatt said, "this is James Callahan. He owns a cattle ranch about 8 miles north of town. He is offering to pay your debt and give you employment if you are willing. You would be his housekeeper and cook. Are you interested?" "Yes," Eleanor said immediately, then caught herself. Yes, Marshal, I am very interested. I am a good cook, Mr. Callahan. My mother taught me, and I managed my father's household for 5 years before he passed. I know how to keep a house clean and organized, and I'm not afraid of hard work." James Callahan stepped closer, and she could see the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of long hours in the sun and wind. "I believe you, Miss Hartwell. The work is honest, and I pay fair wages, $20 a month plus room and board. You would have your own cabin on the property, separate from the main house, so your reputation would remain intact. I have 3 ranch hands who live in the bunkhouse, and they can vouch for my character if you have concerns. $20 a month. Eleanor's father had been a clerk and made $35, but he had been supporting both of them. $20 would be hers alone, more money than she had ever had in her life. And her own cabin, privacy, safety, independence. "I accept, Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice stronger now. "Thank you for your kindness. I will work hard to prove myself worthy of your trust." Something flickered in those blue-gray eyes, approval, perhaps, or relief. "I do not doubt it. Marshal, if you would unlock the cell." Wyatt grumbled, but produced his keys and unlocked the door. Eleanor stepped out into the office, blinking at the sudden increase in light and space. She felt dizzy for a moment, and James Callahan reached out to steady her elbow. "Easy now," he said gently. "When did you last eat?" "This morning," Eleanor said, though in truth it had been a bowl of watery gruel that barely qualified as food. "I am fine, truly." "You are pale as a ghost and swaying on your feet," Callahan observed. "We will stop at the hotel restaurant before we head to the ranch. You need a proper meal." "I cannot let you spend more money on me," Eleanor protested, even as her stomach cramped with hunger. "You have already done so much." "Consider it an advance on your wages," he said firmly. "A good employer makes sure his workers are fed and healthy. Come along, Miss Hartwell." He guided her toward the door with a hand that remained respectfully on her elbow, never straying or gripping too tightly. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes again, but this time they were tears of gratitude and overwhelming relief. As they stepped out into the bright afternoon sunshine, she took her first breath as a free woman and whispered, "Thank you, Mr. Callahan. You have saved my life today." He looked down at her, and for just a moment his stern expression softened into something warmer. "You are welcome, Miss Hartwell. Now let us get you that meal." The Dodge House restaurant was far finer than anywhere Eleanor had eaten in months. White tablecloths covered the tables, and the smell of roasting meat and fresh bread made her stomach clench with anticipation. James Callahan led her to a corner table and pulled out her chair before seating himself across from her. When the waitress came, he ordered roast beef, potatoes, green beans, fresh bread, and 2 slices of apple pie without consulting Eleanor, somehow knowing exactly what she needed. As they waited for the food, an uncomfortable silence settled between them. Eleanor smoothed her wrinkled skirt self-consciously, aware of how disheveled she must appear. Her traveling dress, once a respectable dark blue calico, was now stained with sweat and jail dust. Her hair hung in tangled waves around her shoulders where it had escaped its pins. "I must look a fright," she said quietly, unable to meet his eyes. "You look like someone who has had a difficult few weeks," James said matter-of-factly. "There is no shame in that. Once we get to the ranch, my sister left behind some clothes that might fit you. Sarah was about your height, maybe a bit broader in the shoulders, but the dresses should work well enough until you can make or buy your own." "That is very generous," Eleanor said, finally looking up at him. "You did not have to do any of this. Why did you?" "The marshal was right. I am a complete stranger to you." James leaned back in his chair, considering his words carefully. 3 years ago, I was flat broke and desperate. I had come to Kansas from Texas with nothing but my horse and a dream of starting my own ranch. I was sleeping in livery stables and eating whatever I could hunt or trade for. One day I was trying to buy supplies on credit, and the shopkeeper was about to have me arrested for vagrancy. An older rancher named Thomas McKittrick was in the store. He paid for my supplies, took me out to his ranch, and gave me a job. He taught me everything about running cattle in Kansas, and when he died 2 years ago, he left me 500 acres and a starter herd in his will. Said I reminded him of his son who died in the war." He paused as the waitress brought their food, and Eleanor stared at the heaping plate before her with something close to reverence. She forced herself to eat slowly, even though her body screamed to devour everything immediately. "Thomas gave me a chance when I needed it most," James continued, cutting into his own meal. "He changed my life. When I saw you in that cell today, I thought about how easily I could have been in your position, locked up over a few dollars with no hope and no future. I cannot repay Thomas. He is gone, but I can pay his kindness forward. If you work out well as my housekeeper, then we both benefit. If not, well, at least you will have had a chance to get back on your feet." Eleanor swallowed a mouthful of the most delicious beef she had ever tasted. "I will work out well, Mr. Callahan. You have my word. I will not let you down." "I believe you," he said simply, and the conviction in his voice made her chest tighten with emotion. They finished their meal in more comfortable silence, and then James paid the bill and led her out to where his horse and wagon waited. The wagon was sturdy and well-maintained, loaded with supplies from the general store. He helped her up onto the bench seat and then climbed up beside her, taking the reins with practiced ease. As they rolled out of Dodge City heading north, Eleanor watched the town fade behind them and felt as though she were leaving her old life behind as well. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the endless prairie in shades of gold and amber. The landscape was so different from the wooded hills of Missouri she had grown up in, flat and vast and seemingly empty, though she could see cattle grazing in the distance, and occasionally a farmhouse or soddy broke the monotony of grass and sky. "It is beautiful in its own way," she said aloud, not really meaning to speak. "It grows on you," James agreed. "When I first came here, I thought it was the loneliest place on earth. Now I cannot imagine living anywhere else. There is something about all this open space that makes a man feel free. Or a woman, I suppose." "I do not think I have ever felt truly free," Eleanor admitted. "Even before my father died, I was always taking care of someone or something. My mother died when I was 18, and I kept house for my father until he passed from pneumonia last winter. Then I had nothing. No family, no money, no prospects. My cousin in Abilene was my last hope for family, but now I wonder if she even exists. The address my father gave me was from a letter she sent 20 years ago. After you have settled in at the ranch and saved some money, I can take you to Abilene if you want to search for her," James offered. "It is only about 80 miles east. We could make the trip in a few days." Eleanor turned to look at him, surprised by his continued generosity. "You would do that?" "Why not? I make supply runs to Abilene a few times a year anyway. Having company on the road would be pleasant." He glanced at her and smiled slightly, and she noticed for the first time that he had a dimple in his left cheek when he smiled. It softened his entire face, making him look younger and less careworn. She found herself smiling back. "Then yes, I would appreciate that very much. Though I suspect by then I may have found a home at your ranch if you will have me." "I suspect you may be right," James said, and something in his tone made Eleanor's heart skip a beat. They rode in companionable silence for another hour as the sun sank lower and the air began to cool. Finally, James pointed ahead to where a cluster of buildings appeared on the horizon. "That is the Broken Arrow Ranch," he said, and Eleanor heard the pride in his voice. "My land." As they drew closer, she could make out the details. The main house was a solid two-story structure built of timber and stone, with a wide front porch and real glass windows that glinted in the fading light. To the left stood a large barn, a corral with horses, and a long bunkhouse. To the right, she saw a smaller cabin, a chicken coop, and what looked like a vegetable garden badly in need of attention. Beyond everything, cattle dotted the grassland for as far as she could see. "It is wonderful," Eleanor breathed, and meant it. This was a real working ranch, prosperous and well-maintained. She had expected something far more primitive. "Thomas built well," James said. "The main house has 4 bedrooms, a parlor, a dining room, and a good-sized kitchen. The cabin over there was Sarah's. It has a bedroom, a small sitting area, and its own stove for heat. You will be comfortable there." He drove the wagon up to the main house, and immediately 3 men emerged from the bunkhouse. They were all in their 20s or early 30s, dusty from a day's work but curious about the woman James had brought home. "Boys, this is Miss Eleanor Hartwell," James said as he helped her down from the wagon. "She is our new housekeeper and cook. I expect you to treat her with complete respect, or you will answer to me, understood?" "Yes, boss, la safo," they chorused, pulling off their hats. James pointed to each in turn. "Miss Hartwell, this is Charlie Moss, Pete Donovan, and Jack Turner. They are good men and hard workers. Charlie, you are the best with words. Please explain to Miss Hartwell that I am not a tyrant, and they are allowed to speak to her like normal human beings." Charlie, a sandy-haired man with a gap-toothed grin, laughed. "Boss is fair and decent, Miss Hartwell. We will look after you same as we would our own sisters. Welcome to the Broken Arrow." "Thank you," Eleanor said, warming to their friendliness immediately. "I look forward to cooking for you. I hope you will tell me honestly what you like to eat so I can learn your preferences." "Anything that is not burnt or still moving will be a blessing, miss," Pete said earnestly. He was stocky and dark-haired with kind brown eyes. "Boss means well, but he cannot cook to save his life." "I heard that, Pete," James said dryly, but there was no real anger in his tone. "Make yourselves useful and help me unload these supplies. Miss Hartwell, let me show you to your cabin." He grabbed a crate of provisions and led her across the yard to the small cabin. The door was unlocked, and when he pushed it open, Eleanor saw a tidy space that was dusty from disuse but fundamentally sound. A iron bed frame stood in the corner with a rolled mattress, a small table, and 2 chairs occupied the center of the room. A pot-belly stove sat against one wall, and a trunk rested at the foot of the bed. Shelves lined another wall, and cheerful gingham curtains hung at the single window. "Sarah kept it nice," James said, setting down the crate. "I will have the boys bring over blankets and linens. The trunk has her old clothes. She said you were welcome to them if we ever hired another woman. There is a pump outside for water, and the privy is behind the chicken coop. It is not fancy, but it is clean and private." "It is perfect," Eleanor said honestly, running her hand over the smooth wood of the table. "I never expected to have my own home again. Thank you, Mr. Callahan." "James," he corrected gently. "We are not formal out here, Eleanor. May I call you Eleanor?" "Yes, of course," she said, feeling her cheeks warm at the sound of her name in his deep voice. "Good. Now it is getting late, and you have had an exhausting day. I will have Charlie bring over everything you need for tonight, and you can start your duties tomorrow. Take this evening to rest and settle in." "What about your supper?" Eleanor protested. "You hired me to cook." "I have survived this long on my own cooking," James said with a slight smile. "One more night will not kill me. Rest, Eleanor. Tomorrow will come soon enough." He left before she could argue further, and Eleanor stood alone in her new home, feeling overwhelmed by the sudden turn her life had taken. This morning she had woken in a jail cell with no hope. Now she had a job, a home, and a benefactor who seemed almost too good to be true. She sat down on one of the chairs and let herself cry, not from sadness or fear, but from sheer relief and the release of weeks of pent-up tension. A knock at the door came 20 minutes later. She wiped her eyes quickly and opened it to find Charlie standing there with an armload of blankets, sheets, and towels. Behind him, Pete carried a basket of food, and Jack held a lantern and a box of matches. "Boss said to bring you everything you might need," Charlie said cheerfully. "Pete has bread, cheese, cold chicken, and some canned peaches for your supper. Jack has light, and I have bedding. Where do you want it all?" Eleanor directed them, touched by their efficiency and kindness. Within minutes they had made up her bed with clean sheets and blankets, set the food on her table, and lit the lantern. Charlie showed her how to work the stove, promising to bring kindling in the morning, and then all three men tipped their hats and left her in peace. She ate her simple supper slowly, savoring every bite, and then changed into one of Sarah's nightgowns from the trunk. It was too big in the shoulders, as James had predicted, but it was clean and soft and smelled faintly of lavender. She crawled into bed as full darkness fell outside, and despite her exhaustion, she lay awake for a long time listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the prairie night. Cattle lowing in the distance, horses nickering in the corral, the wind whispering through the grass. She thought about James Callahan and his steady blue-gray eyes, his quiet generosity, the way he had treated her with respect when she had nothing and no one. She told herself firmly that gratitude was not the same as affection, that she must not mistake his kindness for anything more than Christian charity and practical need. But as she finally drifted into sleep, she found herself hoping that tomorrow would bring another opportunity to see him smile. Eleanor woke before dawn, conditioned by years of rising early to prepare her father's breakfast. For a moment she was disoriented by the unfamiliar room, and then memory rushed back. She was at the Broken Arrow Ranch. She was free. She had a job and a home. She rose quickly and washed from the basin of water she had drawn the night before, then dressed in one of Sarah's work dresses. It was a simple brown cotton with a white collar, and though it was slightly large, it was far better than her ruined traveling dress. She braided her hair and pinned it up, then hurried outside into the pre-dawn darkness. The ranch was beginning to stir. She could see lamplight in the bunkhouse and hear the sounds of men moving about. She walked quickly to the main house, hoping James would not mind her entering without invitation, and let herself into the kitchen. It was a good-sized room with a large cast-iron stove, a long work table, shelves stocked with supplies, and windows that would let in plenty of light once the sun rose. She found matches and lit several lamps, then set about examining what she had to work with. There was bacon, eggs, flour, cornmeal, coffee, dried beans, potatoes, onions, canned tomatoes, and various other staples. The coffee pot was clean but well used. She could work with this. Within 30 minutes she had coffee brewing, bacon sizzling in a pan, and biscuit dough ready for the oven. She scrambled a dozen eggs and set the table in the adjoining dining room with plates and cutlery she found in a sideboard. As the sun began to paint the eastern sky pink, she heard boots on the front porch, and James appeared in the kitchen doorway. He stopped short, staring at her in surprise. His hair was damp as though he had just washed, and he wore clean work clothes. "Eleanor," he said, and she heard astonishment in his voice. "I told you to rest today." "I rested all night," she replied, flipping the bacon. "This is what you hired me to do, James? I am not afraid of work, and I will not have you thinking I intend to be lazy. Besides, cooking makes me happy. It is something I know I can do well." He moved into the room, drawn by the smell of fresh coffee and bacon. "It smells better in here than it has in weeks," he admitted. Sarah was a good cook, but even she would be impressed by this spread. "It is just bacon, eggs, and biscuits," Eleanor said modestly, but she could not help feeling pleased by his praise. "Nothing fancy." "To a man who has been eating burned beans for weeks, it is a feast," James said. He poured himself coffee and leaned against the work table, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "You did not have to start work today, but I am grateful you did. Truly grateful. You saved me from a jail cell and gave me a home," Eleanor said quietly, meeting his eyes. "Cooking you breakfast is the least I can do." Something passed between them in that moment, a connection that made Eleanor's breath catch. Then Charlie's voice called from outside, breaking the spell. Boss, we got a problem with the fence on the north pasture. James sighed and set down his coffee cup. I had better see what that is about. Will you ring the bell when breakfast is ready? The boys will come running. Of course, Eleanor said, and watched as he strode out of the kitchen with the confident walk of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. She finished preparing breakfast, found the dinner bell hanging by the back door, and rang it loudly. Within minutes, all 4 men were seated at the dining room table, and Eleanor served them heaping plates of food. Their grateful expressions and enthusiastic eating told her everything she needed to know about the quality of her cooking. Miss Eleanor, if you cook like this every day, we are going to be the luckiest ranch hands in Kansas, Jack said through a mouthful of biscuit. He was the youngest of the 3, probably no more than 22, with red hair and freckles. I will do my best, Eleanor promised, but you must all promise to tell me honestly if you dislike something. I cannot improve if I do not know what needs changing. Fair enough, Pete agreed, but I cannot imagine disliking anything you make after what we have been suffering through. James shot him a look, but there was amusement in his eyes. That is enough criticism of my cooking, thank you. We all know I am terrible at it. Terrible is being kind, boss, Charlie said, grinning. Remember when you tried to make stew and somehow turned it into charcoal? The men laughed, and Eleanor found herself smiling at their easy camaraderie. This was a good place, she realized. These were good men. She had landed in a situation far better than she could have hoped for. After breakfast, the men headed out to work on the fence, and Eleanor spent the morning exploring the house and making a mental list of everything that needed attention. The place was fundamentally clean, but showed clear signs of bachelor neglect. Dust on every surface, windows that needed washing, floors that needed scrubbing, and laundry piled in corners. She rolled up her sleeves and went to work. By midday, she had cleaned the kitchen until it sparkled, washed the breakfast dishes, swept the dining room and parlor, and started a pot of beef stew for supper. She found a vegetable garden behind the house that was choked with weeds, but still had viable tomato plants, beans, and herbs. She spent an hour weeding and watering, pleased to see that the garden had good potential. She was carrying water from the pump when James returned on horseback. He dismounted and led his horse to the corral, then walked over to where she stood. "How is your first day going?" he asked, taking the heavy bucket from her hands without asking and carrying it to the garden. "Wonderfully," Eleanor said honestly. "I have cleaned the kitchen and dining room, started supper, and begun working on the garden. I think with some attention, it could produce quite well." James looked at the partially weeded garden and shook his head in amazement. "Sarah would be thrilled to see someone taking care of her plants again. She loved that garden. I am afraid I let it go to seed after she left." "Well, it will not go to seed anymore," Eleanor said firmly. "Fresh vegetables will be much better for all of you than living on canned goods and dried beans." "You are already proving worth far more than $20 a month," James observed. "At this rate, I should be paying you double." "You are paying me fairly," Eleanor said, though warmth spread through her chest at his praise. "I am just doing the job you hired me for." He studied her for a moment, his blue-gray eyes serious. "You are doing far more than I hired you for, and we both know it." Most housekeepers would not have started work before they were asked, and they certainly would not have cleaned half the house in one morning while also making plans to resurrect a dead garden. "You are remarkable, Eleanor Hartwell." She felt her cheeks flush. "I just like to be useful," she said softly. "I spent too many weeks feeling helpless and worthless. It feels good to work hard and see results." "Then I'm glad I can give you that opportunity," James said. His hand moved as though he might touch her arm, but he caught himself and stepped back. "I should let you get back to work. Thank you again for breakfast. It was the best meal I have had in months." He walked away before she could respond, leaving Eleanor standing by the garden with her heart beating faster than it should. She told herself again that this was just gratitude, just the natural warmth of a good employer and employee relationship. But something deep inside whispered that it was beginning to be something more. The days settled into a comfortable rhythm. Eleanor rose before dawn each morning to prepare breakfast, spent her days cleaning, cooking, and managing the household, prepared hearty suppers, and returned to her cabin each evening tired but satisfied. The main house slowly transformed under her care. Windows gleamed, floors shone, curtains were washed and rehung, and the smell of fresh bread and simmering stew replaced the musty odor of neglect. The garden flourished under her attention, providing fresh tomatoes, beans, squash, and herbs that elevated her simple meals. The chickens, which had been half wild and laying eggs in random locations, began producing reliably once she established a feeding routine and cleaned out their coop. She churned butter, baked pies, made preserves, and even convinced James to buy her fabric so she could sew new curtains for the parlor. The ranch hands treated her with unfailing respect and growing affection. Charlie taught her about cattle and showed her how to spot problems in the herd. Pete shared his knowledge of horses and helped her overcome her nervousness around the large animals. Jack, who had a hidden talent for woodwork, repaired her cabin door and built her a shelf for books. They teased her gently and made her feel like part of their odd little family. But it was James who occupied more and more of Eleanor's thoughts as the weeks passed. She found herself watching for him throughout the day, looking for excuses to bring him cool water when he worked near the house, asking his opinion on household matters that she could easily have decided herself. He was unfailingly kind but maintained a certain professional distance that both reassured and frustrated her. She caught him watching her sometimes with an expression she could not quite read, but he never said or did anything inappropriate. 6 weeks after Eleanor arrived at the Broken Arrow Ranch, a severe thunderstorm rolled across the prairie. She was in the main house preparing supper when the sky turned an ominous green-black and the wind began to howl. James burst through the kitchen door, rain already plastering his hair to his head. "Tornado weather," he said tersely. "We need to get everyone to the cellar, now." Eleanor had heard about tornadoes but never experienced one. Fear clutched at her throat as she followed James to the storm cellar behind the house. Charlie, Pete, and Jack were already there, helping to secure the doors. James practically pushed Eleanor down the stairs into the underground space, then climbed down and pulled the heavy doors shut above them. The cellar was small and dark, lit only by 2 lanterns. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with preserved foods and supplies. There was barely enough room for all 5 of them, and Eleanor found herself pressed against James's side as the storm raged overhead. The sound was terrifying, a roar like a freight train combined with the shriek of tearing wood and the hammer of hail on the cellar doors. The whole structure shook. Eleanor could not stop herself from pressing closer to James, and his arm came around her shoulders, pulling her against his chest. "It is all right," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos. "The cellar is solid. We are safe here." She buried her face against his shirt, breathing in the scent of rain and leather and something uniquely him. His heart beat strong and steady beneath her ear. Pete was praying quietly in the corner. Charlie and Jack sat in tense silence. The storm seemed to last forever. When the roaring finally faded and the shaking stopped, they waited another 10 minutes to be sure before James cautiously opened the cellar doors. Rain still fell, but the deadly wind had passed. They emerged to survey the damage. The house was intact, and so were the bunkhouse and barn. But Eleanor's cabin had taken a direct hit from something, perhaps a falling tree branch or flying debris. The roof was partially collapsed, and one wall had caved in. Her few possessions were exposed to the rain. "Oh no," she whispered, staring at the destruction. "It could have been so much worse," James said grimly. "If you had been in there instead of the main house, you could have been killed. We will rebuild it, Eleanor. For now, you will have to stay in the main house. There is a guest room upstairs that is perfectly suitable." "I cannot stay in the house with you unchaperoned," Eleanor protested automatically, though her heart was not in the argument. The thought of sleeping under the same roof as James filled her with a confusing mixture of impropriety and longing. "Your reputation will survive," James said firmly. "Charlie, Pete, and Jack can vouch that nothing inappropriate is happening. We all live on the same ranch anyway. It is Not as though we are alone in town where people might gossip. Your safety is more important than outdated social conventions. He was right, of course, and Eleanor was secretly relieved. Her little cabin, which had felt so cozy and safe just hours ago, now looked like a pile of rubble. The men helped her salvage what they could from the cabin. Her clothes, mostly undamaged though wet, and the trunk that had miraculously survived. They carried everything to the guest room in the main house, a pleasant space with a comfortable bed, a small desk, and a window overlooking the garden. That night, Eleanor lay in bed listening to the rain and the sound of James moving around downstairs. She knew he was checking the house, making sure everything was secure. Eventually, she heard his footsteps on the stairs and the sound of his bedroom door closing. He was just down the hall, separated from her by 20 feet and 2 doors. It felt simultaneously too close and too far away. Over the following weeks, the unusual living arrangement changed the dynamic between them. They saw each other first thing in the morning when they were both still half asleep, and last thing at night when their guards were down. They shared breakfast at the kitchen table before the ranch hands arrived, talking about their plans for the day. They sat together in the parlor some evenings, Eleanor mending or sewing while James worked on his account books, the silence comfortable and domestic. James began to share more about his life, his childhood in Texas, his father who died when he was 16, his decision to head north to Kansas seeking better opportunities. Eleanor told him about her parents, her lonely years as her father's housekeeper, her shattered dreams of family and belonging. "You have family now," James said one evening, looking up from his ledger. "All of us here on the ranch. We are your family, Eleanor, if you want us." "I do want that," she whispered, her throat tight with emotion. "More than anything." Their eyes met and held, and Eleanor saw something in his gaze that made her pulse race, but then he looked away, clearing his throat. "Good," he said gruffly. "That is settled then." The rebuilding of her cabin began, but it progressed slowly. James insisted on doing the work properly, which meant it would take several months. Eleanor suspected he was not particularly motivated to rush the project, and she could not bring herself to push him. Living in the main house with James had become precious to her, even though she knew it was dangerous to her heart. August arrived with its oppressive heat. One afternoon, Eleanor was working in the garden when she heard a commotion from the direction of the corral. She looked up to see James wrestling with a panicked horse, trying to calm the animal. Something had spooked it, perhaps a snake or a rattling noise, and it was rearing and thrashing dangerously. Without thinking, Eleanor ran toward them. "James, let go, you will be kicked." But he would not release the horse. He was trying to grab its halter to regain control. Eleanor saw the exact moment when the horse's hoof connected with his shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground. She screamed and ran faster, reaching him just as Charlie and Pete came running from the barn. The horse had bolted away, still panicked. James was conscious, but clearly in pain, his face white and his left arm hanging at an awkward angle. "I think it is dislocated," he ground out through clenched teeth, "and need to pop it back in." "We need to get you inside first," Eleanor said, her voice shaking. "Charlie, Pete, help me get him to the house." They managed to get James into the kitchen and seated in a chair. Eleanor sent Jack racing to town for the doctor, then fetched cool water and clean cloths. James's shoulder was already swelling and turning purple. "I have seen my father reset a dislocated shoulder," Charlie said hesitantly, "but it is going to hurt like hell, boss." "Just do it," James gasped, "before it swells too much." What followed was agonizing to watch. Charlie and Pete worked together to manipulate James's arm back into its socket, and the sound James made when it popped back into place would haunt Eleanor's dreams. Then he slumped forward, unconscious from the pain. "Is he all right?" Eleanor cried, cradling his head. "He just passed out," Pete reassured her. "It is probably better this way. Let him rest." They managed to get James upstairs to his bedroom and into bed. Eleanor sat beside him, bathing his face with cool water, her hands trembling. This man had saved her from jail, given her a home and a purpose, and become more important to her than she had ever intended to admit. The thought of losing him terrified her. James regained consciousness a few minutes later. his blue-gray eyes focusing slowly on her face. "Eleanor," he murmured. "What happened?" "You were kicked by the horse," she said gently. "Your shoulder was dislocated, but Charlie reset it. The doctor is on his way. You're going to be fine, but you need to rest." "The horse?" he said, trying to sit up. "The horse is fine," she said firmly, pushing him back down. "Pete caught him and checked him over. There was a snake in the corral that spooked him. The snake is dead now and the horse is calm. Everything is under control. You need to rest." He looked up at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "You were so scared," he said softly. "I saw it on your face when you ran to me." "Of course I was scared," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "I thought you were going to be killed." "Would that have mattered to you, Udor?" he asked, his words slightly slurred from shock and pain. She stared at him, knowing she should deflect the question, maintain the professional distance they had carefully preserved. But fear and relief had stripped away her defenses, and the truth came pouring out. "Yes, James," she whispered. "It would have mattered very much. You matter very much to me." His good hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she had not realized had fallen. "You matter to me too, Eleanor, more than I should probably admit. More than I ever thought anyone would again." "Again?" she breathed. "I was engaged once," he said quietly. "Back in Texas before I came to Kansas. Her name was Catherine. She broke it off when I lost my family's ranch after my father died. Said she could not marry a man with no prospects. It taught me to be careful with my heart." "I am sorry," Eleanor said, covering his hand with hers. "She was a fool to let you go." "Maybe," James said. His eyes were growing heavy, the pain and shock catching up with him. "But if she had not, I would never have come to Kansas. I would never have built the Broken Arrow, and I would never have found you." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face now. "James, But he had fallen asleep, his hand still cradling her cheek. She gently removed it and tucked his arm against his side, then sat watching him sleep until the doctor arrived an hour later. Doc Harrison examined James, confirmed that the shoulder had been properly reset, and left instructions for his care. He would need to rest for at least 2 weeks, keep the arm in a sling, and avoid heavy work for a month. Eleanor listened carefully to every word, determined to ensure James followed the orders exactly. For the next 2 weeks, she devoted herself to nursing James back to health. She brought him meals in bed, helped him dress and undress, read to him when he was bored, and scolded him when he tried to do too much too soon. The forced intimacy of caring for him in his vulnerability broke down the last barriers between them. James, for his part, was a terrible patient. He chafed at being confined to bed, worried constantly about the ranch, and tried to work even with one arm. But he also watched Eleanor with an intensity that made her skin warm, and he found excuses to touch her hand, to keep her sitting beside him, to keep her close. On the 10th day of his recovery, Eleanor brought him lunch and found him sitting up in bed with a serious expression on his face. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. Eleanor set down the tray, her heart beginning to pound. "About what?" "About us," James said. "About what is happening between us. Eleanor, I'm not a man who plays games or speaks in riddles, so I'm just going to say this plainly. I am falling in love with you. Actually, I think I have been falling in love with you since the moment I saw you in that jail cell, looking so scared but so determined. These past weeks, living in the same house, having you care for me, it has just made me more certain. I love you, Eleanor." Eleanor sank down onto the edge of the bed, her legs suddenly weak. "James, You do not have to say anything right now," he interrupted gently. "I know this is sudden. I know I am your employer, and that complicates things. I know you might feel obligated or grateful, and I do not want that. I want you to choose me because you want me, not because you feel you owe me, so take your time. Think about it, but I needed you to know how I feel." "You think I need time?" Eleanor said, and suddenly she was laughing and crying at the same time. James Callahan, you impossible man, I am in love with you too. I have been for weeks. I just did not think you could ever see me as anything more than your housekeeper. The expression on his face was worth everything. Shock and joy and hope all mixed together. You love me? He repeated, as though he could not quite believe it. Yes, you stubborn fool, she said, leaning forward to rest her forehead against his. I love you. I love your kindness and your integrity and the way you treat everyone with respect. I love how hard you work and how much you care about this ranch and the people who work for you. I love your laugh and your rare smiles and even your terrible cooking. I love you, James. Eleanor, he breathed, and then he was kissing her, his good arm pulling her close. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, and then deeper as weeks of suppressed longing poured out. Eleanor's hands tangled in his hair, and she kissed him back with all the love and passion she had been holding inside. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, James was smiling, that full, genuine smile with the dimple that she loved so much. Marry me, he said. I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other for 2 months, but life is short, Eleanor, and I do not want to waste a single day of it without you by my side as my wife. Yes, Eleanor said without hesitation. Yes, I will marry you. Today, tomorrow, whenever you want. Just yes. He kissed her again, and this time there was triumph in it, and possessiveness, and the promise of a future together. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Dodge City. Eleanor wore a new dress of pale blue silk that James had insisted on buying for her, and she carried wildflowers from the prairie. Charlie, Pete, and Jack stood as witnesses, grinning like fools. The ceremony was simple and brief, but when the preacher pronounced them man and wife and James kissed her, Eleanor felt as though her heart might burst from happiness. The ranch hands had decorated the main house with ribbons and flowers in their absence, and they returned to find a wedding feast laid out. Contributions from neighboring ranchers and townspeople who had heard about James's marriage and wanted to celebrate. Eleanor was overwhelmed by the warmth and acceptance of this community that had become her home. That night, lying in James's arms in the master bedroom that was now their shared room, Eleanor thought about the strange path that had led her here. $3. That was all it had taken to change her life. $3 of debt that had put her in a jail cell, and $3 of generosity that had given her everything. What are you thinking about? James murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. About how $3 changed my entire life, Eleanor said. If Mrs. Pemberton had not had me arrested, if you had not come into the marshal's office that day, if you had not been the kind of man who would pay a stranger's debt, I would be in such a different place right now, probably still trapped, still helpless, still alone. You were never helpless, James said firmly. Circumstance was against you, but you were never weak. I saw that strength in you from the beginning. That is part of what made me fall in love with you. I am glad Mrs. Pemberton had me arrested, Eleanor said, and laughed at the absurdity of the statement. I never thought I would say that, but it is true. That terrible day was the beginning of the best thing that ever happened to me. The best thing that ever happened to both of us, James corrected, pulling her closer. I was so lonely before you came. Eleanor, I did not even realize how lonely until you filled this house with warmth and laughter and love. You saved me as much as I saved you. She tilted her head up to kiss him, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. Then we saved each other, she whispered against his lips. And now we get to spend the rest of our lives being grateful for it. The years that followed were not without challenges. There were harsh winters and summer droughts, cattle diseases and low market prices, injuries and setbacks. But Eleanor and James faced everything together, their love growing stronger with each passing season. Eleanor proved to be not just a talented housekeeper, but a shrewd business partner. She expanded the vegetable garden into a substantial operation, selling produce to the town and the army fort. She started raising chickens on a larger scale, and her eggs and butter became famous for their quality. The extra income helped the ranch prosper even in difficult years. 2 years after their wedding, Eleanor gave birth to a son they named Thomas, after the man who had given James his start. The boy had his father's blue-gray eyes and his mother's dark hair, and from the moment he entered the world, he was loved beyond measure. James was a devoted father, carrying Thomas everywhere with him once the boy was old enough, teaching him about the ranch and the land. Eleanor would watch them together and feel such overwhelming happiness that it sometimes brought tears to her eyes. 3 years after Thomas came a daughter they named Sarah, after James's sister. She was a spirited child with red gold hair and green eyes that came from some distant ancestor. She kept them all on their toes with her energy and curiosity. Charlie eventually married a widow from town and brought her to live in the rebuilt cabin that was supposed to have been Eleanor's. Pete and Jack stayed on as loyal ranch hands, eventually buying their own small spreads nearby with James's help and advice. The Broken Arrow Ranch became the center of a small community of families who supported each other through good times and bad. On their 10th wedding anniversary, James took Eleanor on the trip to Abilene they had once discussed. They left the children with Sarah and her husband, who had moved back to Kansas and lived just 10 miles away. In Abilene, they searched for Eleanor's cousin using the old address her father had given her. They found the house, but a different family lived there now. The neighbors remembered the family Eleanor sought. They had moved to California 5 years earlier, chasing the dream of gold and opportunity. Eleanor felt a pang of sadness, but it was distant and small. "I used to think finding my cousin was my only hope for family," she told James, as they stood on the street outside the house. "Now I realize I already have everything I need. You, our children, Sarah and her family, the ranch hands who have become like brothers to me, that is my family. That is my home." "I am glad," James said, pulling her close, "because I cannot imagine my life without you in it. You are my home, Eleanor. You always will be." They stayed in Abilene for a week, enjoying the rare opportunity to be alone together without the demands of children and ranch work. They danced at a hotel ball, ate leisurely meals at fine restaurants, and spent long hours talking about their dreams for the future. On their last night in town, as they walked back to their hotel under a sky full of stars, Eleanor thought about how far she had come from that terrified woman in a jail cell. She thought about the kindness of a stranger who had become her husband, the home they had built together, the children they were raising, the life they had created. "I love you, James Callahan," she said, stopping in the middle of the boardwalk and taking his face in her hands. "I love you more than I ever thought it was possible to love another person." "I love you too, Eleanor Callahan," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Every day for the rest of my life, I will be grateful that I walked into that marshal's office and saw you. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." They kissed there in the starlight, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. The years continued to pass. Thomas grew into a strong, capable young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did. Sarah became a teacher in Dodge City, educating the children of the town with patience and creativity. More children came. Another son they named William, and a second daughter they called Margaret, who had Eleanor's determination and James's steady temperament. The ranch prospered under their joint stewardship. James expanded the cattle operation and began breeding superior stock. Eleanor's vegetable and egg business grew so successful that she hired help from town. Together they built the Broken Arrow into one of the most successful ranches in the region, known not just for its prosperity, but for the way James and Eleanor treated their workers with fairness and respect. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a surprise party. The ranch was filled with friends and neighbors, and there was dancing and music and enough food to feed an army. As the sun set and the lanterns were lit, James led Eleanor out to the porch of the house where they had shared so many quiet evenings. 25 years, he marveled, his arm around her waist. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I walked into that jail and saw you. Other times it feels like you have been in my life forever." Both are true, Eleanor said, leaning against his shoulder. She was 48 now, her dark hair threaded with silver, her face bearing the lines of a life well lived. James was 53, his hair more gray than dark, his face weathered by decades in the sun. But when she looked at him, she still saw the steady, kind man who had paid $3 to free her and offered her a job in the same breath. "Do you ever regret it?" James asked softly. "Marrying me so quickly? Spending your life on this ranch instead of in a city with more society and culture?" "Never," Eleanor said fiercely, turning to face him. "Not for a single moment. This ranch is my dream, James. You are my dream. This life we built together is more than I ever hoped for when I was that scared girl in a jail cell. You gave me everything. We gave each other everything," he corrected, just as he had on their wedding night. "I was just surviving before you came. You taught me how to truly live." Their children and grandchildren, for Thomas had married 2 years earlier and already had a baby daughter, came looking for them then, pulling them back into the celebration. But Eleanor carried the warmth of that conversation in her heart as they danced and laughed and celebrated surrounded by the people they loved. The seasons continued their eternal cycle. Spring brought new calves and garden planting, and summer meant long days of hard work under the blazing Kansas sun. Autumn was harvest time and preparation for winter. Winter brought rest and reflection, and time spent around the fire with family. James and Eleanor grew old together gracefully. Their hair turned white, their steps grew slower, but their love never dimmed. They passed the day-to-day running of the ranch to Thomas while remaining involved in the decisions and celebrations. They delighted in their grandchildren, passing on stories and wisdom. On a warm spring evening when Eleanor was 63 and James was 68, they sat together on the front porch watching the sunset paint the prairie gold and crimson. It was their 40th wedding anniversary, and earlier that day the whole family had gathered for a celebration. Now it was just the two of them, comfortable in the silence that came from 4 decades of knowing each other completely. 40 years, Eleanor said softly. "Can you believe it has been 40 years since you paid $3 to get me out of jail?" "Best $3 I ever spent," James said, and she could hear the smile in his voice even without looking at him. "Though technically I gave you $5 total. You never did pay back that extra $2. Eleanor laughed. "I gave you 40 years of cooking and housekeeping and love. I think that more than covers $2. "It does," James agreed, reaching for her hand. His grip was not as strong as it once had been, but it was still warm and sure. "It covers 1,000 times that. Eleanor, I need you to know something. When my time comes, and I know it will be sooner rather than later—" "Do not talk like that," Eleanor protested, but he squeezed her hand gently. "Let me finish. When my time comes, I will go peacefully and happily because I have lived a full life with the woman I love. I have no regrets, Eleanor, not a single one. You made every day of these 40 years worth living." Tears streamed down Eleanor's face, but they were not entirely sad tears. "You did the same for me," she whispered. "You saved me, James, and then you loved me, and you gave me a life more beautiful than anything I ever dreamed possible." They sat together as the sun sank below the horizon, and the stars began to appear. Two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and built something lasting and true. James lived another 7 years, long enough to see all his grandchildren grow and to meet the first of his great-grandchildren. When he finally passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 75, Eleanor grieved deeply but found comfort in their children and the legacy they had built together. She remained on the ranch for another decade, helping Thomas manage the operation and serving as the family's anchor and storyteller. She told her grandchildren and great-grandchildren about the day she was imprisoned for owing $3, about the cowboy who paid her debt and offered her a job, about falling in love and building a life together. When Eleanor passed away at the age of 80, surrounded by her family, her last words were of James and the love they had shared. She was buried beside him on a hill overlooking the Broken Arrow Ranch, and on her gravestone, Thomas had inscribed the words, "She owed $3. He gave her the world." The ranch continued through the generations, each one adding their own stories and accomplishments, but always remembering the foundation that James and Eleanor had laid. The tale of their meeting and their love became family legend, passed down through the years as an example of how a single act of kindness could change everything. In the end, it was not the $3 that mattered. It was the choice James made to show mercy to a stranger, and the choice Eleanor made to trust that mercy and build something beautiful from it. Their story became a testament to love, second chances, and the truth that sometimes the most extraordinary lives begin with the smallest acts of grace. The Broken Arrow Ranch still stands today, worked by the descendants of James and Eleanor Callahan, and on that hill overlooking the land they loved, their graves remain side by side for eternity, just as they were in life. Two souls who found each other against all odds and never let go.